Okay, so good morning, everyone, to our first session for the Emerald Ash Borer University, our first session in 2024. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the Exotic Forest Pest Specialist with Purdue University's Department of Entomology. The Emerald Ash Borer University is a program that's done in partnership with Michigan State University and Ohio State University, and today I'm joined by my colleague Amy Stone from Ohio State University. Today, we are going to be talking about box tree moth. And talking to us today is going to be Dr. Joe Boggs from Ohio State Extension. I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself and get rolling with what he has to share with us today.
Well, that was very nice of you to elevate me to doctor. It's just Joe Boggs. I'm with Ohio State University Extension based in Hamilton County. That's greater Cincinnati. And also, I have an appointment with the OSU Department of Entomology. And you already heard Amy Stone's up in Lucas County in Ohio. And we've long worked together on non-native invasives. But I also need to recognize whoops, hang on for a second, Bob. I think I'm frozen. Okay, here we go. Ohio Department of Agriculture, we have a very good partnership with our ODA, and I want to recognize them because they play an extremely important role in this whole story with box tree moth. So Courtney Folks is the lead on box tree moth for the Ohio Department of Agriculture. Ken Reed is in charge of the nursery inspectors. And we all know nursery inspectors, if you haven't worked with them, you'll discover when you do work with them, they have x-ray vision. They can just see things that, quite frankly, even as an entomologist, I wasn't picking up with box tree moth. So again, a very nice partnership there. And of course, Dan Kinney, who is a plant health division chief with ODA, and others. And I want to stress that because this is not just a single presentation with my perspectives. This is also working in partnerships. It brings me to my second point, though, relative to box tree moth, and we do have some very helpful publications. I want to recognize another person, too. Alan Proxmire is the USDA National Policy Manager for box tree moth, and the USDA has a very nice publication, New Pest Response Guidelines for box tree moth. All you have to do is just Google USDA box tree moth guidelines and it will come up. And then there are numerous papers on box tree moth, thankfully. This is one I'm highlighting because it really does a nice job. Even though it was published in 2022, David Coyle, maybe you may know him with Clemson University. It was provides a really nice overview. So again, these are just helpful, one of many publications out there, which brings me to my third point. When we talk about box tree moth, is it just another boxwood problem? I recognize that this is becoming a bit of the perception. Every time we have something new with boxwoods, it seems to subtract from their value in the minds of even the industry, but also perhaps even homeowners. But they are some of the oldest, if not the oldest, landscape plants that we see in our landscaping today. Records in North America date back to the late 1600s with boxwoods. They remain one of the most common landscape plants in North America, and even though we don't have the numbers, I think you would probably agree that it's most likely that in a home landscapes, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of landscape value. For example, what you're seeing here is in Cincinnati, and you can see boxwoods are a dominant feature. This landscape alone probably has thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of boxwoods. We know, for example, that the estimated value of boxwoods in Ohio nurseries alone is about $200 million. And certainly it's a very common production plant in other nurseries in other states. So, but when it comes right down to the value of boxwoods, what other plants can realistically replace boxwoods? That's a question that we started asking ourselves, way back with boxwood blight, which I'll get to in just a bit. Is it okay if we might lose something like we did with ashes? And I'm not comparing box tree moth to emerald ash borer only from the perspective that it's just another non-native invasive, but the impact is very, very different. But if we considered it that way, What would we use as a replacement? Is it just boxwood, death, and taxus? So here's some values to consider. Boxwoods are evergreen. This eliminates privet. I mean, privet, when you take a look at it, oops, um, does look boxwood-like, but it's not evergreen. Deer resistance. This is a big point with boxwoods. I mean, here's privet, which is deer resistant, but it's not evergreen. And there's arborvitae, and you can see, well, that's also deer food, as well as taxus and even junipers. This is something we tend to overlook. And I have to tell you, I've actually added this in very recently based on observations over the past few years. We tend to forget that boxwoods do bloom. They are prolific bloomers. But there's something important to keep in mind. They don't all bloom at once. They are spring bloomers. They tend to, depending on the species, variety, and cultivars, some start very early and then kind of progress through the spring. And that provides a very handy early season pollen and nectar source for a number of different pollinators. This was taken to Spring Grove Cemetery and Arboretum just last week. And there are quite a few ground nesting bees, which we know are extremely important pollinators. And in that location, boxwoods are just buzzing with these little bees. So a very important nectar and pollen source in the spring, and a wide range of site conditions. Now, obviously, there are limits, but at least in my neck of the woods, this eliminates ilex, for example, the hollies. This is what our hollies tend to look like because of our poor drainage and high soil pH. Now, that's not true throughout North America, but the point I'm trying to make is boxwoods have long held this status, true status, of being a pretty tough plant. We can pass its limits sometimes, but overall, we can get away with boxwoods in a lot of places that we can't get away with other things. Finally, many forms and functions. So in landscape designs, because of the high genetic diversity, boxwoods can fit into a lot of uses. Again, all the shots that you're seeing here were taken in Greater Cincinnati. So you can see hedges, another hedge, but formed a little differently. And of course, this is formed very differently. And of course, then we can have uprights. You know, it took me a while to figure out why box tree moth was not called boxwood moth. Well, in the native range for boxwoods, China and Europe, we don't have native boxwoods. They do grow in a tree form, and this is no doubt kind of what they look like, although this is, particular cultivar, little leaf boxwood, tall boy, but nonetheless, all kinds of different forms and then their functions in landscape designs brings me to my fourth point, what we know about box tree moth. And these are the things that we can list that we can say, all right, we're pretty solid with this information. For example, so far in North America, it appears that box tree moth is exclusive to boxwoods. Now, you will find in the scientific literature references, for example, that they may be able to feed on euonymus. We haven't seen that yet, at least here in Ohio, and I don't think elsewhere. So far, they seem to be pretty tight with only affecting boxwoods. And I've changed this. Some of you have heard me speak about this before, might note that the label for this used to say is a boxwood killer. I've changed it to a potential boxwood killer, and you'll see why in just a little bit. But regardless, boxwoods must be monitored because the shadow of box tree moth is falling upon them in North America. The insect is native to China, Taiwan, India, and the Koreas and Japan, and it was first found in Europe in 2007, and is now widespread in Europe. But again, I want to stress, what's the native range of boxwoods? So here we have the native range for box tree moth. And you can see all the way from Japan, the Koreas, over into India, a huge range. And of course, not coincidentally, the so-called Asian boxwoods, which, we kind of lump that together, also has this very wide range, geographical range. However, box tree moth is not a consistent threat in its native range, and that you might expect that to be true. Now, just very recently, I've been in contact with a number of individuals, one being Dr. Gary Gao, who is with OSU Department of Horticulture and OSU Extension, who is native to China, and was speaking with Gary to see if he could find out just what's the impact of box tree moth in China. Well, it's like our native insects that, particularly those that have a limited host range, they're not much of a pest on their native hosts. It's the same in China. And it's probably, no doubt, due to inherent resistance. Again, they grew up together, as well as the three Ps: predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. In fact, there have been some publications on this very topic about what does regulate box tree moth in China. Of course, as I mentioned, 2007, it showed up in Germany, and of course, very rapidly spread throughout Europe. Once again, though, there's a big difference between Europe and North America. And the first big difference is boxwoods are native. So high box tree moth populations tended to develop in forests. We don't have boxwoods growing in our forests. And then those provided bridges between landscapes and vice versa for box tree moth to spread rapidly. In North America, you look at boxwoods as almost being like islands. If you drive around and look at different landscapes, you don't see boxwoods in between. You see them in landscapes, and that means we have the potential for being able to manage these defined sites much easier than in Europe. So in 2018, box tree moth was discovered in Toronto. Then 2021, Niagara County, which is not, much of a surprise, just across the way. And of course, then in Windsor, and then in Michigan in 2022, and in 2023, last summer, it was found in my neck of the woods in Hamilton County, actually where 4 counties come together here. Of course, not coincidentally, we see, that it is up here in these other counties of New York, and then out here on Cape Cod, and then in September, it was found in Montgomery County. So think Dayton. And of course, at that time too, 10 counties in Michigan were quarantined. So we've just seen this gradual discovery. I'm hesitant to say spread. Obviously, spread is happening, but discovery, meaning very seriously that we need to be all on the lookout for this. But our infestations so far are the southernmost found in North America. And the moths didn't fly down here, so they were brought here accidentally. And again, we need to stress that, occurring in locations that probably they removed before box tree moth was discovered. Another important point geographically, though, is that maybe, and I'm just saying, I'm planting a seed, maybe we have some little different life cycles down here, even though it doesn't seem that far. We'll get to that in just a bit. So what we know, box tree moths are very easy to kill. I mean, we have a lot of different tools to get rid of them. And just as an example, now this is from a talk by Alejandra de Puzo with Virginia Tech, who's done a lot of work with box tree moths up in New York, state of New York. And so these are some preliminary assays that he did on treated foliage, and you can see, very high level of mortality. Also, if you go online and just do a search for this fact sheet, based on, this is an IR4 project and partnership with NC State, Cornell, and Rutgers. Now I'm going to show you the table of materials that this group of authors believe will have impacts on box tree moth. Now, these have not all been tested. However, they've shown very substantial impacts on caterpillars, Lepidopteran caterpillars specifically. So we're not going to talk about these individually, but they have a table in there with 21 active ingredients. And by the way, they're listed by mode of action, the IRAC mode of action. So they're not listed by alphabetical order, although it may look that way. So the point being is, to avoid resistance, we want to recommend that people choose products out of different modes of action. So you're not just focusing on one, but again, a wide range of modes of action, a wide range of materials. I'm highlighting BT because, as an example, in one location down here in Greater Cincinnati, we have an individual that also has honeybees very close to his boxwoods. So, he's going to select to use Bacillus thuringiensis, BT. And that has also, though, that has looked good in some preliminary work done up in New York. So once again, a wide range of products that could be used. What we don't know, though, exactly where are the infestations? How many generations in southern Ohio or even points further south? All the effective management options. We have a lot of possibilities and even some that are being tested as we speak. But then what are the next steps? So we'll be getting to that too a little bit later. But, how are we going to handle this over the long haul? So a little short segue relative to what we do and don't know. We would hope that you would reach out and get timely factual information, however you might find to do that. But one that we would recommend is starting with just the facts. I've dated myself badly here with what we call the Buckeye Yard and Garden Line, or the Beagle, as we affectionately call it. This fetches just-in-time facts. And this is, if you sign up for Beagle Alerts, this is what you'll get. So I'm going to use what we posted last year on other things besides just Boxwoods, box tree moth, as well as the box tree moth posting, just to give you a flavor and also talk about some different points. So March 3rd, last year, bad looking boxwoods. Now, this isn't unusual. I think you'd all agree, depending on the, again, species, variety, and cultivar in your location, sometimes you do see the winter browning. I don't want to use the word exactly damage. It's just simply some of the boxwoods get a little brown in the winter and then they recover. And so this wasn't too much of a surprise. Also, we have boxwood leaf miner in our area, another non-native, and they can cause boxwoods to look very bad. And last year we had a very unusual thing in terms of a deep diving temperatures in December of 2022, which led to some very peculiar looking box tree moth symptomology, which almost made them look like a disease. And of course, winter damage, not outside the realm of possibilities. Of course, things changed for us on June 26th. So way up in the summer when box tree moth was confirmed in my part of the country. And so we posted on it immediately in conjunction with the Ohio Department of Agriculture with their press release. And there you have it. And then we came along July 3rd to post something on terms of what to look for. What do you need to be on the lookout for with box tree moth? By then we were getting our own pictures and monitoring what was going on. We also, and this isn't unusual for Beagle postings, we also provided some selective references to the scientific literature. On July the 11th, latest observations, because we wanted to keep people informed. Okay, so what's going on? This is where we kind of highlighted, okay, you might see some silking. You'll see that in the literature too. Then we kind of hit the brakes. July 17th, revisiting Volatella and brown boxwoods. Now, I think, well, wait a second, Joe, now you're talking disease all of a sudden. There's a very important reason for that. We started seeing some very serious damage to our boxwoods because of those deep diving temperatures that I mentioned in December 2022. And this has really caused some challenges, both with the perception of box tree moth itself and discovering a box tree moth, as well as the perception of the uses of boxwoods in landscapes in general. So this is box tree moth damage. You'll notice you're seeing right through these shrubs. The leaves are being consumed. This is severe winter damage, again, because of the crash diving temperatures the week of Christmas of 2022. Notice the difference, the leaves are still on. This is February 11th, and again, this was a little bit harsh, I'd say. This is a little harder winter damage than we normally see, but nonetheless, on February 11th, I can tell you when I took this shot, I wasn't overly concerned, but then I came back in late July, and I started becoming a lot more concerned. What do you see that would concern me? Well, recovery should have been at least complete by then. But look at this. We're still seeing browning, and then elsewhere, August 2nd. Notice that the browning appears to be progressing. Winter damage doesn't progress through the summer. It's an all or nothing. You get the damage, either it recovers or it doesn't. This is progressing. You can see August 2nd. Look at these chlorotic leaves. Something's happening there, and brown, and the leaves are clinging on. August 18th, you see the common denominator here is that this is a progressive thing. And I just took this, about a week ago, showing boxwoods that just continued to progress with this dieback. So what am I referring to? Well, first, I just want to remind you, this is what boxwood should look like. I'm referring to a disease that has a direct connection to that winter damage. This is confirmed Volatilla canker, confirmed by our lab in Ohio. Now, if you want, you need to, in my opinion, and I think others on this, you need to use a lab that has been accredited by the National Plant Diagnostic Network. You can find them. For example, you go on to the directory for Ohio, and there are the labs that are accredited by NPDN. And so we want you to confirm it, because Volatilla blight canker, and blight is because it can affect the leaves, it's caused actually by two different fungi, Pseudonectria buxi and Pseudonectria follicula. But buxi was first described in 1815. This is not a new disease, is what I'm trying to say. It's been known for a long time. It's had 25 different scientific names associated with it, including Volatilla buxi. That's no longer valid, but that's where we get Volatilla blight and canker. These are weak pathogens, meaning they infect weakened or damaged tissue. So again, you see the leaves are holding on, and there is the canker. If you cut here, you can isolate the infected tissue and you can solve the problem. That's a big point. This would fail to isolate the pathogen. And of course, when we're doing any kind of pruning or any kind of cutting on infectious tissue, we would want you to use something to disinfect. I use this concentrated Lysol because plant pathologists have shown with boxwood blight that this active ingredient does eliminate the pathogen. Now, and you just mix it up into a bottle as a concentrate and be able to spray it on your pruners and other equipment. You could use hand sanitizer, is readily available, as long as the alcohol content is fairly high. This is also a very good antiseptic for getting rid of pathogens, but be reasonable. I mean, we don't want you wasting good stuff, because this can help make you forget about these problems. But nonetheless, if we take a look at what was going on last year, you can see here is one of our local parks, and you can see this dieback. Now, they didn't get it confirmed, but it looked to me like Volatilla, probably, maybe. And then they came along and pruned all that out. Yes, that created openings, but I'm going to come back to the exact spot this summer, and I will bet that you will not be able to see those opened areas. Unlike this, the overarching point is this to all of you that are listening. That is, because of this severe damage, it didn't just happen in Ohio. It also happened in Indiana, Kentucky, elsewhere in the upper Midwest, and I think even some of the eastern states. It caused people to change their perception of boxwoods, and it got worse when landscapers, when when people didn't respond to prune it out. Boxwoods can recover very quickly when they have sections pruned out, but you can see these are too far gone. But they didn't prune it out, and so it made people believe that boxwoods just are not good. Of course, we do have boxwood blight. This is confirmed. This is what it kind of looks like. You see these areas that are where you can see the symptomology. And again, here's an overlapping view. Not coincidentally, this wasn't irrigated, but boxwood blight, the fungus does very well under high moisture conditions. So typically heavier infections in the spring. We do see these blackened areas of dieback. Whole leaves, though, are held until they drop. Box tree moth does not present these types of symptoms. The big point is do not field diagnose boxwood blight, because as it turns out, this is based on the clinic results from Ohio and Kentucky. I may have these reversed, but I think in Ohio all last summer we only had, I think, 3 positives. I think Kentucky had 4. It could be reversed. My point being is that's pretty rare. And that's possibly due to inherent genetic resistance. We do know there was work done if you want to go, look into this, is one of the best scientific papers I've ever seen published on any plant disease at NC State, where they inoculated boxwoods at a level that you never see in the field, and disclosed that yes, there are some highly resistant varieties and cultivars, and even some species. Point being is that we thought boxwood blight was going to be a real problem. It is a problem, but there are resistant types. But I want to stress, do not tell your clients when you see boxwoods like I've shown before that they're being killed by a blight. Boxwood blight is becoming very rare. Now, I believe you may have all gotten, I talked to Bob about this as my handout, was this very last posting on box tree moth, because it probably does the best of all of them in terms of showing all the different things you need to be looking for. Also, this is where we reported the new detection outside of Dayton. So I just want to stress, get the BIGL, get the facts. This is being recorded, so you can go back and see how you would subscribe. We don't just post on box tree moth. We post on a wide range of other things, and this is how you would subscribe. So we're going to shift into a pictorial guide to box tree moth. First, let's stress again, there are no native pests that specifically defoliate boxwoods in Ohio. You might say, wait a second, Joe, you just talked about boxwood leaf miner. Well, it's non-native. And frankly, boxwood leaf miner causes the boxwoods look very bad, but they do recover. You don't see the type of defoliation that you will see with box tree moth. This is box tree moth. And the other point is, if you find a caterpillar on boxwoods defoliating those boxwoods, it is almost certainly box tree moth. I cannot think of another even general defoliator, because boxwoods actually are loaded up in quite a few plant toxins. It's why they're resistant to deer. They can actually harm goats of all things. So we don't have a lot of other pests that have cracked that chemical case to be able to make use of boxwoods. So if you see caterpillars feeding on boxwoods, it's a high probability it's box tree moth. And those are going to be striped caterpillars. They have a very easy way to discriminate from other caterpillars. You see these stripes and these black spots, tubercles on there. And you see this all the way through the instars, even the early instars, very, very consistent in their appearance. Now, this is a very interesting symptomology. I call it a curlicue leaf damage. I've never seen this by any other leaf feeder, and for some reason they tend not to feed along the edges. I don't know why, I don't know what's happening there, but because of that, you'll see when they're finished, you'll see this kind of curlicue like symptom. Now, this doesn't last very long, as you might imagine. This breaks off pretty easy. So yeah, a heavy rain, it would knock a lot of this off. But if you're monitoring boxwoods, this really stands out. I mean, look at this in the light. And there's another feature on here, not just the curlicue damage, but also notice the silk webbing. So that's another thing to point out. These do produce webbing. They do have silk glands on either side of their mouth parts, just like a number of other caterpillars. Then they do spin silk. So you'll often see remnants of silk on infested plants. When they pupate, they tend to draw together leaves and stems and net them together with silk. But I don't want to go too far. It's not like fall webworm. It's not like some of our other more notable silk producers. The reason why I'm stressing that is that early on, I was actually looking for something like this, because I was reading, they're prolific silk producers. Yes, a little bit, but not like this. It's very rare to see this amount of silking. This is fall webworm. It's not like that. Frass, insect excrement, dry insect excrement is called frass. And so here we see it hanging up in the plant. It's a very nice term, by the way, that entomologists use. It can be a stand-in for other things. You can say things like, well, I feel like frass today. Or Amy Stone sometimes says, I look like frass, which is true. So it's a very nice little stand-in to share with you as a little side note. But this is also a very good indicator that you have a foliar feeding caterpillar. And of course, you can see that there's still a lot of foliage on here, but look at the amount of frass already being generated and dropping underneath the plants. So it's a good indicator that you do have a foliar feeding insect, possibly box tree moth if it's under boxwoods, most certainly box tree moth. And then bedraggled see-through stick shrubs. As you can see right through these. The leaves are being consumed. They're not dropping off. And by the way, a little side note, I just noticed this. Remember I said earlier that box tree moth, we haven't seen it feeding on other things? These boxwoods eventually became totally defoliated. You might notice in this image, there's euonymus down here, probably winter creeper. They never dropped down and fed on this. They starved to death instead of feeding on that. So just a little side note there. But again, see-through boxwoods, the leaves have been consumed, and you can see this from a distance. The leaves aren't laying on the ground, as opposed to winter damage and disease and possibly disease infection or boxwood leaf miner. This is actually what you're seeing right now with boxwood leaf miner, these blister-like mines. That's the lower leaf surface. You open them up and there are the maggots because it is a type of fly, a midge fly. And spring symptoms commonly, if you have high populations, look like this. This is not winter damage. You probably remember this was the original Beagle that I said, bad looking boxwoods. This is all boxwood leaf miner damage. And of course, a very odd thing, and this is becoming more common, at least in my neck of the woods, bird predation on these little, maggot meat morsels. Most likely tufted titmouse, but there are a number of birds that are discovering this to be a very good treat. It's kind of unfortunate because you can get some pretty heavy damage. This is all taken in my neck of the woods, and this has been reported elsewhere. I'm not the first to see this by any means. As a matter of fact, there was a thesis on boxwood leaf miner. I can't draw up the student or the date, but nonetheless, if you go online, you'll run across it. And he very well documented this. But this is the point I made earlier. These are boxwoods that were heavily damaged in the spring by boxwood leaf miner. Look what they look like by midsummer. You could not even tell. And that is a very important symptomology. Box tree moth will not get better. It will just get worse. Boxwood leaf miner, you see the damage in the spring, and then as the season rolls along, it gets better. Yes, there are probably, if there's a high population, larvae here, but they're not causing symptoms yet. So, continuing with the pictorial guide, here is what the moth looks like. They're not great flyers. They're in the family Crambidae, and these are kind of flitter flyers. But something that's very important, if you go online, you'll see there are these two different color forms, this more dusky color form and this lighter one. As far as I know, I think that this is what dominates in North America. I do not believe, I could be wrong, but I don't think this has shown up. But it's pretty solid to say, all right, this is what the adults look like in North America. And here is the best thing that we could have. There are synthetic female pheromones. I think there are two of them that have been synthesized. Apparently, the female is a combination, two different molecules. Nonetheless, synthesized and can be put in traps to attract the males. It's exactly like what is used by the females to attract the male. And of course, here's a dead male that arrived in that trap, had other things in mind, but nonetheless turned out that we were able to discover him. And this is a very important tool because it provides a lot of information. It can be used to determine the number of generations. We're going to see that in just a second. Also, detection, the geographical distribution of box tree moth, and finally, potentially suppression. Let's pretend you have a very tight population. You may be able to mass trap them out of there. And then when I'm talking about mating disruption, that's where you flood the environment with the pheromone. And it just confuses the males. They cannot find the females. Very effectively used strategy, for example, for spongy moth, which used to be called gypsy moth. Mating disruption has become the go-to way to suppress populations. So we're going to kind of finish up here talking about an important point relative to box tree moth. Number of generations. It's critical information for management. Now, if you take a look at this publication in 2014 out of China, and by the way, I do want to emphasize, though, in China, it is not a major pest because it is native on native. However, where non-native boxwoods have been planted in China at some of their universities, it is a major pest because they're non-native boxwoods. They didn't grow up with this caterpillar. But you'll see, based on location, there can be 3 to 5 generations. So I put this graphic together just to kind of demonstrate what happens with complete metamorphosis, and also to be able to describe to you graphically the development of box tree moths. So every insect starts out as eggs. When those eggs hatch, if they have complete metamorphosis or Holman metabolus, as we call them, then we'll see a series of molts. Each time that caterpillar molts, it has to, because that's its exoskeleton. In order to get larger, it has to molt. It has to shed its exoskeleton. Each time it passes from one to the next molting, we say it goes from first to second to third to fourth to fifth to sixth to seventh. Now, I'm putting maybe here because there's some disagreement in the literature as to whether box tree moth has 6 or 7 generations. You will see both in the literature. Not sure what's going on there, but I just wanted you to recognize, okay, sometimes you'll see it reported as 6, sometimes you'll see definitively as 7, but nonetheless, quite a few instars. And that's important because this is the feeding stage, this is the damaging stage. And of course, then you go into the pupal stage, which if it were a butterfly, this would be called a chrysalis. So think a monarch chrysalis, that's a pupal stage. And with box tree moth, pupae are very apparent. Now, usually I've unfurled the leaves. Usually they're sequestered inside leaves, but they start out with this very green coloration. Eventually you can see coloring up. You can sort of make out the adult inside that pupal case. And finally, of course, what emerges from the pupal stage are the adults. Now, box tree moth has apparently everywhere that I'm seeing in the literature, these what I'm referring to as a split generation, meaning that they spend the winter, they go into the winter as early instar caterpillars. Now, the literature again is a little bit iffy on whether it's a third, fourth. I need to actually start highlighting second, but nonetheless, let's just say early instar larvae. So in the fall, you'll see the larvae produce these structures called a hibernaculum, plural hibernacula, and this is what they look like. You see underneath the leaves, or some leaves will be pulled together, and you see this very dense silking, and you can see the caterpillar inside. And this is why I said earlier, or just said a minute ago, that we need to kind of think about whether it's a second or third, because this is a very early instar caterpillar. I would guess it's probably second instar, and that's what we have seen. But it kind of doesn't matter. My point to you is that it doesn't spend the winter as eggs, it spends the winter as early instar caterpillars and these hibernacula. And of course, spring rolls around and the development picks back up to complete that generation, that split generation. Adults are produced, eggs are laid, and we get a first complete generation. And then eggs are laid. After the development of that generation, we get a second complete generation. I'm showing this because it's been determined that in Ontario and Buffalo, New York, it's pretty solid that there are 2 generations. But remember what you just saw in China and also in Europe. Depending on the geographical locations, there can be as many as 5 generations. And maybe we have more than 2 in Southern Ohio. Maybe we have a 3rd generation. So I'm going to show you some data from last year. Again, Ohio Department of Agriculture, they've really been on this heavily. And you'll see this is trapping data. And by the way, note that they're not doing it by dates. by growing degree days, meaning that just this measures developmental rates based on accumulated temperature development. So at any rate, you'll kind of see there are definitely two peaks, but maybe a third. Well, I want to stress something. We didn't know the box tree moth was in Ohio in this zone. And you notice this cluster down here? Well, that's because traps were being deployed to find it. So this data is a lot cleaner simply because these traps were deployed and they were deployed over a wider area. This is where the data was just being developed. So Courtney was just talking the other day with a group and made it very, very clear that they're going to start earlier this year and to see if we pick up that first complete generation. Theoretically, they should pick up the split generation, and then if we have 3 complete generations, we'll see 3 peaks. But we don't know yet. I'm just trying to plant the seed that possibly there's a 3rd generation. And that's important because more generations equals more damage. Also, a very important point is that the speed of development for any holometabolous insect, cold-blooded insect, and all insects are cold-blooded, are dictated by temperature. So because they're cold-blooded, their metabolism speeds up when it gets warmer, slows down when it gets colder. And so the speed that this progresses is based on temperature. Now, remember I said earlier that different papers have different numbers of instars. So this one says there's 6 instars, but what's important, and this is a lab study done at 25 degrees C's, or C, which translates to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. They're saying that the total larval period is 20 to 31 days. That's in a laboratory with a consistent temperature. So last year, same group of, I want to say this very deliberately, same group of boxwoods, not a large planting of boxwoods. This is a picture I took on June the 28th. And this is what I was finding, these very small caterpillars. I decided to go back 9 days later because I wanted to get middle instars. Look at what they looked like 9 days later. There were no caterpillars that were small. They were snakes in 9 days. Well, what happened? Well, again, it was hot. We had 90 plus degree days consistently through that period. My point to you is this, that even though in a laboratory, we can predict how long different things take, this whole idea of more than one generation is also going to be dictated very seriously by temperature. The warmer it is, the faster they're going to progress. Well, our time together is winding down, and just want to stress a few things. First of all, let's go back to what we know. We know the current infestations. What we don't know is where else. Now, these dark ones, I don't want to plant any seeds here. I have no idea if it's in the Chicago area, if it's in Philadelphia. I have no idea. We don't know that yet because they haven't been discovered. But potentially they could be, which means we need people to look for it and report it. Now, here in Ohio, for example, I would know to report the Ohio Department of Agriculture, but that's different in different states. So depending on the state that you're in, the state that you live in, you can go online to this National Plant Board. Again, just Google National Plant Board, and this will come up, and you'll see members down here. And so you can click on the individual state, whatever state that you reside in, and you will then see the people you should be reporting to. I mentioned Dan Kinney, Division Chief here in Ohio. If you clicked on Ohio, his name and contact information would come up. So you would know, okay, I need to report this to Ohio Department of Agriculture, and here's actually a good, reporting method to do. If we go to one of our neighboring states, if we clicked on Michigan, for example, well, you get something a little different, a tutorial on sign stealing. Okay, folks, I'm a Buckeye, and it's in my contract. Amy Stone knows this, that I have to say something about Michigan. Seriously, I hope Molly isn't on. But if you did click on Michigan, very, very important to know. Their Michigan Department of Agriculture is on this, and that's again would tell you where you would report box tree moth. So the future of box tree moth in North America, eradication is not being pursued in Canada or elsewhere in the US simply because it's probably too widespread at this point. It doesn't mean that we can't manage it, push it back. That doesn't mean this is just a short-term eradication is not being done. Detection and quarantines are going to dominate. This is going to become, it is very important. We want to detect it and keep from it spreading by applying quarantines. I put slow the spread in here because this is looking pretty good up in the Buffalo, New York area, where I mentioned Alejandro de Puzo has been doing work. It's a possibility. And again, I just want to stress insecticide options, they're very easy to kill. There are many effective products, but you need to keep in mind that we can have multiple generations, and also keep in mind not to induce secondary pest outbreaks. Beware of unintended consequences. I, I think this really does show very well what unintended consequences means. Don't get on an elevator with a lion and make sure the tail's inside. Secondary pest outbreaks, I can tell you that I had no pictures of my own of boxwood mite a few years ago. Now, why would we start seeing boxwood mite becoming so common? Well, partially, I believe it has to do with imidacloprid. There's a proven connection where it doesn't kill the mites. It actually stimulates egg production. And imidacloprid, I'm not just blaming imidacloprid. The neonicotinoids, it does look like that they do stimulate egg production, and they've been long used to suppress boxwood psyllid, the insect that causes the cupping of the leaves, as well as boxwood leaf miner. Now, I have no data on this to say this is definitely happening, but it sure seems pretty darn coincidental. And the same thing can happen with pyrethroid insecticides. They can kill the beneficial predaceous mites, and then you get an outbreak. Unintended consequences. What am I trying to say? Well, don't just spray boxwoods because box tree moth, was reported. Do not spray unless you need to spray. That's very important. So what about the future of box tree moth in North America? Well, long term, I have little doubt that the 3Ps will start helping us out: predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but we were very surprised at the level of predation by yellow jackets. Yellow jackets, in fact, all wasps. So we're talking yellow jackets, we're talking paper wasps, we're talking bald-face hornets. They grind up soft-bodied insects like caterpillars and feed that protein to their young. It's where they get protein to support the growth of their young. And so we saw this firsthand. It was amazing. The shrubs were buzzing with yellow jackets. And of course, here's a yellow jacket ripping open leaves to get the little tiny larvae in the hibernacula. I'm not saying yellow jackets are the answer. I'm only saying that this is an example. Also, host resistance. There's work being done right now to start a host resistant trial up in northern New York, and we may have one ourselves. But there's very clear evidence. This was taken in greater Cincinnati at a heavy infestation. In fact, almost all the pictures, almost all, were taken in this landscape. And I didn't even recognize that this was a boxwood, because here you have infested boxwoods, and here's the infested. There was no evidence of box tree moth in these boxwoods. About 100 feet away, I looked over and saw this. I saw these, and I thought, well, these must be privet. No, they are a boxwood. So we don't know what they are. The homeowner doesn't know the exact even species, but nonetheless, that may be determined, by the way, genetically here in the near future. But my point to you is this is demonstrating, and this has been seen elsewhere, it's been seen up in New York, that we do have potential resistance to box tree moth. Well, as Groucho Marx said, time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. And a few final points. Now, I didn't set this up as a as a poll, but I'm just going to do this very quickly because I'm 5 minutes over. Just some very quick true or false myths and misconceptions about boxwoods, box tree moth, and so forth. True or false? Box tree moth will wipe out boxwoods in North America just like it did in Europe. Well, that's false, folks. We don't have native boxwoods growing in our forests. Our boxwood plantings exist as islands, which can be subject to focused management efforts. That is a big point. Anyone who you talk to that has been to Europe and watched this unfold will tell you those boxwoods in forested areas really, just like our ash trees did, all over, allowed a box tree moth to very rapidly move through Europe. We do not see boxwoods in our forests. We don't see them outside of where they were planted. True or false? Box tree moth is easy to control. Hopefully you've picked up that, yes, they are easy to control. They're not hard caterpillars to kill. Here's one method perhaps that we could research. True or false? Boxwood are being wiped out by a blight. This is something that we're seriously trying to overcome. And this is the perception because primarily in my neck of the woods, because of the winter damage, there's a perception, that, well, it's just blight. And unfortunately, we've actually had some professionals telling their clients this, and we just have to be careful. This is patently false. Boxwood blight is actually very rare, and don't field diagnose it. If you see boxwoods dying back, get whatever you think is happening confirmed. Finally, true or false? We should stop planting boxwoods because they have so many problems. Well, think about that. That's false. Do we apply this same logic to other trees and shrubs? For example, this is just a spankling of some of the problems on maples, and verticillium wilt is a killer. Should we stop planting maples just because they do have all these problems? Same with oaks. Oak wilt is a killer. Bacterial leaf scorch is a killer. Does that mean we should stop planting oaks? No, we don't apply that same logic. And I actually contend, those who know me, this is a little inside joke, galls actually add ornamental value to oaks. But again, few may not know what I'm referring to. So the true voyage of discovery lies not in finding new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And hopefully I've given you some new eyes on box tree moth and the value of boxwoods and why we really do need to focus our attention on this new challenge. And that does bring me to the end of the program. I'm a little over, but hopefully we have some time for questions. I'll even stay on later because I took longer, and I'll stop sharing.
All right, we do have a few questions that are sitting in the chat right now. Someone commented that maybe Saturday Night Live needs to do a skit on box tree moth, just like they did for spotted lanternfly. I would definitely like to watch that. We do have a question: is long distance spread most likely on nursery stock?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone agrees with that. And again, we don't want to denigrate nurseries, but I believe probably what we're experiencing happened before it was known that box tree moth was even in our area or even in North America. That's something that you always have to do with a non-native is first start with finding those places where it got to before it was known that the non-native is in North America. And I think we're still in that process. The eggs are, you notice I didn't have a single picture of eggs. I'm hoping to get that this upcoming season. The eggs are very tiny and could be easily missed. But I think now that we're alerting the nursery industry of this potential challenge, I believe we'll be discovering more and more of the infestations. Of course, quarantines will be put into effect, which will then eliminate that spread.
Okay, and then we just have two other questions that got asked here. They're regarding the actual presentation itself. So someone's wanting to see the insecticide treatments. Another person's asking if the presentation will be available for download. I am going to post this presentation just as soon as I can on the YouTube channel. You can find it at Emerald Ash Borer University if you just search it on YouTube. It's also, I included the link in the last email I sent you, so you could find it very, very easily that way. And then we do have a question. Does box tree moth kill boxwoods?
If you do not control it, yes. If you if I should have pointed this out because, like I said, I pulled back a bit, but the very early images that you saw of that very small hedge, that's where it was first. The first caterpillars were discovered. Adults were found based on an individual actually trapping an adult in a blacklight trap in Loveland, Ohio. But those little shrubs, about 2 to 3 feet tall, were just totally stripped. Now I'm going to be going back as the season progresses. We think that they are dead. Most definitely in Europe, box tree moth has killed boxwoods. But the reason why I put potential now is because if left unchecked, I'll also be working with that landscape, the owner of the landscaping where I showed the shots of the potentially resistant boxwoods, just simply because he has bees, honeybees, and also he has a nice collection of boxwoods. I'll be working with him in terms of he's going to be using, I believe, BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. I have no doubt that he will suppress the populations, and I'll be taking pictures. So the point being, if left undetected, if people do nothing, yes, it can kill boxwoods. But I say potentially because it's like a number of our other insects out there that if left unchecked, they can kill their hosts. In this case, if management options are brought to bear, then boxwoods can be protected, or at least the population suppressed where you don't have that damage.
Okay, I do not see any additional questions. So I think we're probably in the clear then. So Joe, thank you very much for taking the time to share with us today. I got a lot of value out of that. I could see several things that I want to change in my own presentations on this I'm going to do in the future. So thank you again. I really, and I'm sure everybody else here really appreciated it.
Well, Bob, I appreciate the opportunity. And I do want to stress one last thing. I want to make sure that everybody hears from me that no, I'm just a messenger. There are a lot of very dedicated people working on this, a lot, including the different departments of agriculture. I did mention Michigan, for example. I know that to be true, as well as Ontario, as well as the USDA, APHIS. I mentioned ODA. The point being is there are a lot of people working on this. Extension is about bringing information to bear. We extend research. And so I don't want people to leave to say, well, I'm an expert on box tree moth. I'm only delivering the message as much as I know. But I do want to stress that there are a lot of people very heavily involved in helping us to manage this insect so things don't go sideways with boxwoods. Thanks a whole lot for letting me speak today.
Yeah, absolutely no problem. I would love to have you again. And with that, everybody, it is time for lunch. So I'm going to let everyone go. And for those of you on YouTube, thanks for watching. Please feel free to comment. And with that, you guys all have a great day.